Good morning and welcome to INSA's breakout session, Midterms 2022, Election Security. I'll be your moderator. I'm Jeff Selden. I'm the National Security Correspondent at Voice of America. Before we get underway, just a couple of things to remind you about. First, we'd like to thank today's breakout session room sponsor, Palo Alto. Also, questions will be submitted via question cards. Please fill them out as soon as you have a question. Don't wait until the end, please. And pass them up the aisle and the person on the aisle, raise your hand. We'll have somebody come along and collect them so we can get some audience questions in. Also, this session is eligible for continuing education credits. If you're interested in obtaining them, please be sure to have your badge scanned at the end of the session by Summit staff in the back of the room. An email will be sent out to those scanned after the summit is over. And just a reminder, media may be present during this breakout session, so we are on the record. Again, welcome to Midterms 2022 Election Security. We have a wonderful panel today, and just to set this up a little bit, conventional wisdom has said that midterms elections, with the lack of a race of national importance, may be less attractive to meddling U.S. adversaries, but will conventional wisdom hold? There's a war raging in Ukraine, Russia always a cyber threat, warning the U.S. against bolstering its support for Kyiv, Iranian-affiliated cyber actors who already got a taste for election meddling back in 2020 seem to be more aggressive than ever in cyberspace. What about China? Always a threat as well. And even U.S. Homeland Security officials pointed to the midterms when they reissued a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin back in June. To discuss these concerns and more, we are fortunate to be able to hear from those who have considerable experience on the front lines and those who are on the front lines right now. From the end, we have Deborah Plunkett, currently principal of Plunkett Associates and a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and Technology, also on several boards, and of course, she was deputy director and then director of the National Security Agency's Information Assurance Directorate, and also served on the National Security Council for multiple administrations. We have Glenn Gristel, a senior advisor now at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 2015 until 2020, he served as the general counsel of the National Security Agency and Central Security Service. He's also a recipient of the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal and other awards as well. Also joining us this morning, Jeff Hale, the Election Security Initiative lead at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's National Risk Management Center, charged with building the election security system's resilience to cyber, physical, and disinformation threats. He's also been a driving force behind Tabletop the Vote, the largest recurring national election security exercise. And finally, we're joined by Grace Hoyt. Grace leads Google's Global Account Security Partnerships as part of a team dedicated to protecting individuals at the highest risk of targeted cyber attacks. Thank you all for joining us. Jeff, if I may, let's start with you. After the 2020 presidential election, then CISA Director Chris Krebs said that that was the most secure election in U.S. history. So let's put you on the spot because that's a high bar. Will CISA be able to say the same of the 2022 elections?
Actually, kind of a funny story behind that, or a little lesser known. Before that was attributed to former Director Krebs, it was a statement from our critical infrastructure partners, meaning Secretary of State as the state's chief election official, a state election director, local election director, the chair of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the head of the National Risk Management Center, 5 different partners across private industry, all came together and felt that that was a moment that they needed to describe the security practices that they had put in place. And so they issued that statement, and it really described that no election before in history had this much threat intelligence, had conducted this many cybersecurity assessments, had done this many physical security assessments, had closed as many vulnerabilities, that had operationalized at a level that was this auditable, that had as many paper ballots. I believe the site was 93%. So the important thing there was this was a built argument, not simply an assertion that wasn't founded. And it's that type of work that we've continued to build upon. The intelligence community partners have gotten even better at publishing it at as a low classification as possible to reach election officials. We have more election officials getting information directly, cyber threat indicators to their systems. So I do think I would never project forward. I am a suspicious person, so a superstitious person. I would never say that the 22 cycle is going to be more secure before it happens, but we have built upon a strong foundation from 2016 to 2020 to now.
As CISA and its partners across state and local governments have upped their game over the last couple of years, U.S. adversaries, of course, are upping theirs as well. How have the threats changed over the last few election cycles, and what are the threats, whether it's foreign adversaries, whether it's cyber attacks, ransomware attacks? What do you worry about the most right now?
So I do think we've observed the barrier to entry for adversaries in this space to attempt to influence, maybe not interfere with elections. It has become really low. What Iran did with the Enemies of the People site, what they did with their video, suggesting that they'd submitted fake ballots, federal write-in absentee ballots, and if you know what that is, you are probably an election SME. That has become so simple to undermine confidence that I expect the playbook is out there. We'll see more actors than ever, and we have to help our election officials, our election partners, posture to address this.
Let me ask you this, but I'll open it to the rest of the panel as well. When you talk about election security, you mentioned some of what Iran has done, we know what Russia has done in the past, and it seems like there are a lot of things that we talk about with election security. There's the disinformation, there's the actual hardware. People have concerns about voting machines. How difficult is it to sort that out? And for you and the other panelists, do we think that the American public has a sense yet of just what election security means, or is part of the battle still fighting some misperceptions about what's going on?
So understanding how elections are run seems simple, but it's taken me several years and really strong partnerships with election officials, because each election jurisdiction across 8,800 election jurisdictions runs it slightly differently. They have different policy environments, they have different rules and statutes guiding how this occurs. So it's hard to make these blanket sweeping statements at a national level and say, yours is secure because X, Y, and Z occurred. So really we have to rely on the ability of local election officials as trusted sources to help educate. I think it's one of the strengths of our system that elections are run locally. It allows individuals to engage their local election official and understand, but there's a lot of that communication that still needs to take place.
Glenn and Deborah, you both have considerable experience in national security, and we saw what Russia did in 2016. We've seen what has been said about Russia, China, Iran in subsequent elections. From the outside looking in now, how has the playbook for those adversaries and perhaps others evolved since 2016? And is there anything that's different or more worrisome about what they've been doing now as the midterms approach?
Sure, thanks. They already got to my microphone here. Yeah. So I would say that what has continued to evolve. I do want to go back to your previous question for a second, because it's a good lead-in to what does the American public know about security, and what are their views on it? And I would say prior to 2020, even 2018, most of America thought they went to the polls, they've cast their vote, and it counted, and that was it. And of course, all of that has changed for a number of reasons. And so the focus now, and the focus of foreign adversaries, is to take, or adversaries period, whether they be foreign or domestic, is to take advantage of our vulnerabilities in the areas of not trusting our systems, not trusting our election apparatus, not trusting the processes, and using that to advantage. That is their greatest advantage, both that and the disinformation, and using it to cast doubt, because really, they don't have to do anything except cast doubt, and that could cause people not to go to the polls. That could cause the public to not trust the systems that are in place.
I would agree, Debbie, thank you. I think as we've made this distinction here between election interference and influence, and I think that's important to keep in mind. The interference has to do with possibly changing vote tabulation totals, affecting the operation of election machinery, the counting of votes, from the election influence, and we've certainly seen that, as you said, back to 2016, when I think the United States was largely caught flat-footed with the efforts of Russian operations, both state and their proxies, to affect the 2016 election. And the 5-volume bipartisan Senate report made that crystal clear. There's no ambiguity about the Russian influence in the area. But on the question of actually changing vote totals and really affecting election machinery, I think that's extremely unlikely, but there's a big caveat to that. And the unlikely has to do with all sorts of reasons that I know Jeff can detail about. There are so many different, over 11,000 counties, 8,000 odd election machineries to jurisdictions who have different machinery. So they're very dispersed targets to act, and it's rather difficult to actually change vote totals. It's very difficult to get involved in the Associated Press tabulation mechanism, which compiles, rolls up all the state totals. So that's pretty technically difficult, not impossible, but pretty technically, but not necessarily an easy target. Offsetting that, and the vulnerability side is, we all know that these election administrations are typically under-resourced, underfunded. They do not have the same levels of cybersecurity that, say, a big bank does. And changing vote totals if there was a sophisticated adversary, such as Russia, that wanted to target swing districts and make a small adjustment in vote totals, while I don't want to be overemphasize the likelihood of it, I still think it's unlikely. Recall that a change of just 80,000 votes in the 2020 election, in the 2016 election, a change of just 80,000 votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and I can't remember, was it Illinois or so, but would have changed the election and denied President Trump his victory. So if you had a electoral interference that actually changed possibly as few as 100,000 votes scattered across a number of key precincts, which would tip the Electoral College, which is easier to manipulate, that could have a very, very serious effect. I think that's extremely unlikely. What I am far more worried about, and I know the panel will address this, is the prospect of election influence, not so much this year, but in 2024, a national election where I think Vladimir Putin, should he still remain in power, probably will, would have every incentive, every single incentive, and almost no disincentive to get involved in our elections if at the time it suited Russia's interest, and that's my chief concern.
Let's stay on that idea of influence, because the intelligence community has warned repeatedly over the last several years that one of the things Russia in particular likes to do, and some others have begun to copy them as well, is to exploit fissures in American society. And anyone who reads the newspaper, turns on the TV, knows there certainly are fissures, political fissures and differences that have gripped the nation. So has exploiting those differences and exploiting those points of tension, is that getting easier for U.S. adversaries like Russia, or because of the efforts that have gone on to educate the American public about this, is it getting harder? Is the public more resilient now to some of those attempts?
So, definitely harder, but harder for reasons that I don't think any of us anticipated, certainly not 2 or 4 years ago. Much harder because we're such a divided democracy. That is why it has become so much, I'm sorry, that's probably the flip. It's a lot easier for them, that's right. A lot easier for them because we've served it up in our political positioning, so that the distrust is there, the lack of confidence in the executive branch or in all of the branches, to tell you the truth, is there. And as a result, it is much easier, I think, to exploit that and use it to advantage, to continue to foment and create that distrust among the American public, for sure.
Can I just add to that? Because I'm particularly concerned about this with the younger generation. People at my generation sort of grew up at a time when there was a curated news, there was a very clear sort of largely accepted version of events. And yes, of course, there were fringe elements in the news media, but it was there were three big news channels that offered news in the evening. There were 2 or 3 key newspapers that people paid attention to. Clearly, in the digital age, that's quite different, and that exposes an unusual vulnerability. There's a story, I think, in today's front page of the New York Times about how Generation Z is particularly prone to finding information out on the internet by going where? To the #1 website in the world, TikTok, and that is replacing Google search as one of the premier destinations for that particular generation. And couple that piece of information with the fact that NewsGuard, a well-respected organization that looks at truth in some online activities, said that 1 in 5 videos on TikTok, 1 in 5 had significant amounts of misinformation or disinformation. So we are at a point where our younger generation, which looks online for their sources of news, is particularly vulnerable when coupled with the fact that we have an absence of civic education directed at that very generation. And you put these ingredients together, and I think it spells real concern for our future. I don't want to over-dramatize it, but I think this is a very, very serious, pernicious problem that is perhaps, in my view, our #1 national security threat.
Glenn, you've spoken before about the idea of election sanctity, and it seems like you're talking about that again now. When you talk about election sanctity, explain for the audience, if you could, what you mean by that, and do you worry that with what you talk about with the disinformation on TikTok, disinformation influence campaigns that are pervasive, both foreign and domestic now, has there been an erosion of the idea of election sanctity and of the basic trust that democracies need to function?
Absolutely. We can see it in poll after poll, which in the case of the last election showed that at one point, I think one of the Pew surveys showed that as high as 40% at one point of the population wasn't sure if President Biden was legitimately elected. That's an incredibly, I'm putting the politics aside, just talking about the institutional sense of legitimacy and our feeling that our representatives are legitimate and we have an appropriate sense of government. That's a terribly, terribly scary thought. I'm sure the percentage has dropped since then. But we have a set of very determined adversaries in this area, which we should spend some time talking about: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, those particular 4 who are our main cyber adversaries. 2 of them are of particular concern, Russia and China, because of their extensive disinformation operations. And Americans are not used to the scale of disinformation and the coordinated sense that these 2 countries establish their campaigns, where they have tweets that are amplified by Facebook posts that are then reported on by such entities as RT, which legitimatize and corroborate this to make it all sort of look more real and more authentic. Americans are not used to that level of very integrated operations that are arrayed against us, and we don't have a lot of good defenses and a lot of good offenses to deal with it. As I mentioned, civic education, public comments. We're also hampered, if you want to view it that way, I don't mean that literally, but restricted maybe is a better sense in terms of what government can do to respond to this because of the First Amendment. I am not, just to be crystal clear, suggesting any diminution of the First Amendment, even by a molecule, but it does present a challenge for us in a free and open society, how we counteract disinformation when our government, for absolutely perfectly good reasons, is supposed to enjoy and tolerate a full range of free speech. And the Supreme Court has made it very clear that Americans have a constitutional right to receive foreign disinformation.
Given how pervasive it is, what can government do? What are some of the things that CISA can do? What are things that other agencies can do? And are there parts of government, are there parts of society that should be getting more active to combat this that perhaps haven't been activated yet? Jeff, if you'd like to take a stab.
So some of the federal partners not present on this panel have certainly have authorities and opportunities when there's influence activity attributed to nation-state actors, but that only takes care of one aspect of this challenge. A lot of this is about the civic education that Glenn's referenced, about promoting resilience, risk awareness, risk education, not determining what is true and false in any particular environment, but really arming the general public, arming critical infrastructure, arming key stakeholders with a constant awareness to be resilient, to be diligent in their consumption of media, particularly through social media, where it can seem like the Wild West at times.
Let's switch it up a little bit here. Grace, I want to bring you in because we're talking about some of the adversaries, and we focus a little bit more right now on disinformation, but there are lots of ways that they go after elections and they try to meddle. And in the past, that's also meant targeting political parties, candidates, campaigns. In your role as Google, working with people who are on the front lines, what are you seeing from the Russias, Chinas, Irans of the world right now?
Thanks. So for a little context, excuse me, I work on the team at Google that's specifically focused on protecting folks like you mentioned in the election space who are at higher risk of targeted attacks. And I think our team, the threat analysis group at Google, has been working on this for over 10 years, and they are seeing a lot of the same. So interestingly, we're seeing that these threat actors are getting more creative, but we're also seeing that things like phishing, government-backed phishing attempts remain some of the biggest threats. So from my standpoint, we want to provide campaigns, the entire ecosystem of high-risk users with really built-in secure products so that they don't have to worry about a campaign spinning up really quickly and winding down quickly, wants to focus on winning. We look a lot at how we can apply automatic protections to our products, such as requiring two-step verification for all Google users. We look at how we can create custom products. So we have something called the Advanced Protection Program, which, as folks know, security keys are about as close to phishing-proof as you can get, so it requires security keys and provides extra protections there. And then we think about partnering to try to combat some of these threats and improve tools for high-risk users. So, for example, we have this mission to have a passwordless future. You might have seen the FIDO Alliance announcement that we're working towards getting rid of passwords altogether. I think we're thinking about ease of use, things like that, so we can take the burden off of these individuals who are really focusing on doing their jobs, and they can focus on that, and we have security built in. So I would say phishing is still a real concern, and our threat analysis group hasn't seen direct targeted attacks on these midterm elections. It's a little bit business as usual, but they're definitely still monitoring. For example, last year, they blocked over 40,000 phishing attempts and sent notifications to folks in the election space who were targeted by those. And they were also the team that published Iran and China's interference with the Trump and Biden campaigns in 2020. So that they're closely monitoring that, and we'll be publishing things as they see it come out. But right now, nothing major to flag on that front just yet.
Can I just ask?
Please.
I don't know if it's acceptable for a panelist to ask a question, but you've touched on something so interesting that I think the audience would like to know. Any sense that ransomware is going to be a factor from your organization when you look at the vulnerability of election entities? Obviously, as you get into October, they have no choice. They absolutely must act and be fully effective. And of course, the ransomware gangs know that. It's sort of like a hospital. Are you seeing any of that, or is that a concern? How do you address that?
Ransomware continues to be a concern. From one way that we tackle that, so Something folks may not know is there's actually never been a successful ransomware attack on a Chrome OS device. So ransomware we put in the categories like this is an entire class of threat we want to wipe out for any Google user. But our threat analysis group is also really interested in collaborating with the security community and sharing information as they see it about ransomware attacks. I focus more on the account security protection side and partnering and adoption of those best practices. But yeah, it's definitely a concern, but nothing to note specifically around, for example, U.S. midterms right now.
So not to take us down a different path, but our focus on Russia and China, on foreign adversaries at an intelligence conference is the right thing, but I'm not sure it's going to be our biggest threat. Just my personal view and professional view is that we have to be very, very concerned about domestic fringe actors and their actions and activities, and whose responsibility is that? And that, to me, I'd love to have that discussion. Whose responsibility is that in order to be able to both detect and to thwart those attempts, which could be many, given what we continue to hear on a daily basis in the national rhetoric. So I don't want us to lose sight of, while the American public is accustomed to us being concerned about Russia and China. We've been concerned about Russia and China and Iran forever. The American public is not so accustomed to us being concerned about a next-door neighbor or a friend around the corner or a colleague. And to me, those are areas that we have got to be paying some attention to.
Makes me think of a couple of questions. And what is the ecosystem like right now in terms of the threats in cyberspace, whether it's the influence campaigns or the targeted attacks on individuals, election systems, election-adjacent systems? Is it just the foreign adversaries? And how much are they piggybacking on each other? How much are they copying each other? And is it always possible to know where a certain threat is emanating from?
Don't know the answers to all of those questions, but I will say that over 90% of information security attacks still start with phishing. So that's where we're still paying the most attention to this space. And I think that can sometimes almost get lost as we think about these new creative threats. And it's true, but these bad actors, wherever they come from, whatever their motivation may be, whether it's financial or ideological, they are finding creative ways, but they're still using the same old rulebook of phish. We just went through a pandemic, such an uptick in COVID-related phishing attempts, right? We were blocking, I think, 18 million of those a day to high-risk users just in the height of pandemic. So I would come back to the basics and phishing as my main area of focus. And in my dream world, every kind of elected official, high-risk individual is using two-step verification, using a password manager, and keeping their software up to date. And that's actually going to solve practically so many of the issues that we've seen. And just to give a sense of the scope of the problem, we did a survey last year, and over 40% of elections workers and journalists in the space had their account hacked or accessed without their permission. And so it's really still happening, and that's where we're really targeting our efforts. And Debbie can probably speak a lot about, she's founding board member of one of our main partners, Defending Digital Campaigns, that does great work training campaigns on just these basics. So I think while there are new and different threats, I want to make sure we don't lose sight of that. We're still working on getting people to kind of take their vitamins, if you will, with things that we've already been seeing for years.
Jeff, please.
To add to what Grace said, when you're thinking about election infrastructure systems and those election adjacent systems, think about the support at a county government. Oftentimes your election network rides on the backbone of your general county systems. So you have these inherited vulnerabilities. So phishing of another part of, phishing local law enforcement, phishing of another part of the county government also can have an impact, if not properly segmented, properly structured, of these, the ability to affect election infrastructure. That's one of the things we've been working on for several years, working to get out there, help to validate at proper logical partitions, proper segmented networks in order to put the security in place that one compromise in a county network doesn't bring the entire county down.
We've gotten some audience questions, and some of them are looking at the level of trust and how does the U.S. get that back? And there are also questions coming in about whether or not there is any evidence that adversaries, whether foreign or otherwise, have been able to go in and change any one vote in any election, a question that comes up time and time again. There's also, to combine it with another question, it's been referenced before, there's all this doubt, and there are a growing number of candidates, and in some areas even officials, who question whether or not votes have been safe. And this is in CISA, you have to work with many officials across the country, regardless of party, regardless of politics. How do you grapple with this when you have so many people, so many different views, and some of them may be very skeptical of the message perhaps that you're trying to share?
So CISA operates almost entirely by voluntary partnership, so it is really at the tolerance of the owners and operators of this critical infrastructure, and that's an important way of kind of helping to derive benefit. But I'll also acknowledge elections are really a competitive community. If Washington State makes some accomplishments, then New Jersey really tries to seize the same moment and one-up them. So security, they don't think in terms of the political dynamics in the day in, day out of election directors. They are looking to provide access to elections and secure them as best possible. So this all kind of boils up that it invites the opportunity for individuals to come and engage in the election process, to join and see the transparency inherent in the chain of custody. And really that's where CISA hopes to support our critical infrastructure partners in making that available, making resources available and information available across all of these jurisdictions so that skeptics can come and see the security of the process for themselves.
Their questions linger, I think, in part because we remember back in the run-up to the 2020 election, and there was the incident where Iranian hackers targeted a number of states and successfully obtained voter registration data in at least one state. Others were able to exploit website misconfigurations. Russian hackers were able to exfiltrate some data. None of these were the critical systems for voting, but they're enough to cause concern. Have you seen any of that so far this election cycle? And what did you learn from those incidents? What's been done to make sure that those systems on the state, local levels are more secure than they were?
So that's always a continued goal, is to support the closing of vulnerabilities, to identify configuration errors. As we saw in 2020, it was a configuration error on a web tool that interconnects with a voter registration database that released data. That didn't mean that the underlying voter registration database had any vulnerability that would affect its integrity. So the election could be administered properly. But the feeling, you mentioned the sanctity of elections at some level. It's a very personal, elections voting is a very personal element. When you see voter data on the web, even though much of it is publicly available for campaigns, for educational institutions, just simply by request, it is an area that your first question discussed. How well do people know elections? Do they know that their data is readily available through voter registration requests? So being able to educate, get people comfortable that some data exposure is normal. It exists already on the dark web. It exists by request. It can be free in some states, is a key element to reducing the likelihood that information's presence is used for misinformation or disinformation. One
audience question that's relevant here is the communication that CISA has with the different states and local partners, and specifically, and perhaps, Jeff, you can touch on this, maybe Grace or Deborah as well, but what is the status of sharing election threat information? Obviously, 2016, it was a new threat, and resources were scrambled to do that. How well is that information sharing taking place right now? And are the states, are the campaigns, are the candidates getting the information they need in a timely enough way?
So on the cybersecurity side, I think there's been a lot of advancements. One of the main ones was the funding of the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. We're really good with names. But what that has is all 50 states, territories, and more than 3,000 local jurisdictions are directly members of this organization that pushes out cyber threat indicators in a timely manner in order to keep kind of a best and resilient threat posture or best and resilient security posture to new threats. There's a different process when it comes to physical security, and you kind of, our panelists alluded to that. And the ability to connect information through law enforcement and state fusion centers to get a picture of what common threats are occurring, common physical threats. While they may be felt in one jurisdiction, the coordination may be occurring nationally. So what happens in Maricopa County may be relevant to Wisconsin. And that communication is occurring through state fusion centers largely.
You know, I agree that we've made great strides in election security in terms of the physical aspects of voting, the electronic tabulation, et cetera. So the risk of actual election interference affecting vote totals, counting, tabulation, et cetera, I think we're in far better shape than we were several years ago. As I mentioned in my earlier comments, that doesn't mean that the door is completely closed on that, and it's possible for a sophisticated adversary to have an effect on our elections if they really wanted to target us. I think there are all sorts of reasons which we could talk about why that is unlikely, and that's the good news. But one thing I am concerned about that I know CISA doesn't directly address is the efforts of political campaigns. I think campaign organizations are terribly vulnerable. That's not a state election apparatus. It's not a county apparatus. It's not even, of course, by definition, not a governmental entity. And campaigns, by their inherent nature, are thrown together really quickly. Lots of amateurs. And whatever funds they have, they're going to be spending on advertising, not on cybersecurity. And yet, we've seen in past campaigns how they are vulnerable to being doxxed, to having their internal emails exposed to the public, et cetera. Embarrassing and just undermining confidence in the system overall, a very pernicious threat. So I think campaigns are a weak spot in the election machinery. That's not literally election machinery, but part of our overall election sanctity.
Deborah, in your role, you work with campaigns, you work with candidates. What are you seeing, and what are you telling them about these threats?
Right, so in my role with Defending Digital Campaigns, an organization I helped co-found about 4 years ago, the focus is, it's a not-for-profit, the focus is on providing free or low-cost cybersecurity products and services to federal campaigns, so presidential and congressional level candidates. And just shout out to Google, one of our prime partners. The good news, I believe, is that across the landscape, we have had many, many cybersecurity firms donating their products and services to this cause. And the other part of the good news is that campaigns are taking notice. And so we've had a good amount of success in getting basic cybersecurity products. And so I can't reinforce that enough. You know, years ago, we used to say 85% of the threats we're experiencing are from known vulnerabilities that could be mitigated because we have solutions to them. I say the same thing today. And so we talk about basics, password management, managing your website, making sure that you have strong encryption. And we not only talk about it, but we now have tools that we can put in the hands of campaigns and are having a good amount of success in doing so. There's a lot more work to be done because, as you might know, campaigns extend far below the federal level. There are state-level campaigns that need a similar level of attention. There are efforts underway to try to work some of that. but there's a lot more work to be done. But we're feeling better this year than we were 2 years ago, and I think in 2 years we'll be feeling even better. The challenge with campaigns is that they're transient. They stand up for a period of time, and almost always the IT person is the junior-most person who knows nothing about IT. Just grab them, because the focus of campaign is not IT, it's on winning. And so trying to get to the right person to get that culture of security inculcated into a campaign that's not focused on it usually is really the biggest challenge. So continuing the education and training is important.
With the campaigns and candidates and clients, Grace, also that you work with, what types of questions are you getting? Are they asking good questions? Are they aware of the problem? Or with the pressure of a political campaign, are they not able to necessarily from the beginning without some help think some of this through about what they need to do to be secure?
They're certainly aware. I would say almost all that we're talking to, we're getting really good questions. It's not a lack of awareness, but certainly they're not security experts. They just weren't designed to be. And so helping them to understand the simple things that they can focus on and apply with minimal resource outlay, sometimes free giveaways, that would help them strengthen their communications and better protect them are really the focus.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think Debbie's being a bit modest. The work Defending Digital Campaigns has done is incredible. I'm just working with them for the past 2 years. Hundreds of campaigns trained in all 50 states. They're nonpartisan. And I do think that Debbie makes a good point. Like this, their job is not to be security experts, and they certainly don't want to have to think about 30 different security organizations and tools, and they need a few simple tips, and DDC does a great job of doing that. And I think for me it would be, if you're using Google, use Advanced Protection Program with the security key, use a password manager, keep your software up to date. It is the basics. But I think what's interesting about campaigns is they are at the tip of the spear often for those new threats that are happening. And again, they just don't have time to think about this. They're focusing on winning. It might be like an intern's the go-to IT person. So at Google, that's why we consider it our job to make those tools so easy that they don't have to decide between being secure and having an easy user experience when they're just trying to send campaign emails out. So that's really our focus at Google, is to kind of raise that bar for them so they don't have to, the campaign manager doesn't have to become that IT expert.
What are more broadly, some of the security precautions, Deborah, Grace, that you advise your campaigns, candidates, clients to take? And is all of it, it's easy to get caught up in the cyber aspect of this, but is all of it cyber? Is there a human element that they have to be aware of when it comes to campaign and election security?
That human element is a place that we start in our discussions because, again, campaigns bring in volunteers. And so we encourage this culture of security that says trust but verify, do background checks, because you don't know if your volunteer is really a volunteer who supports your candidate or your candidate's platform, or if you are a plant intended to take advantage of vulnerabilities in the infrastructure of the campaign. So doing background checks, providing regular phishing exercises and training exercises. And the campaigns roll their eyes up when we talk about this, just like all of you do, everybody else does, right? But how critical is it that you can practice so that when something real happens, you can be able to respond appropriately? And so that human factor is really important because, as Grace has already said, phishing is still the name of the game. It's how they get in. It's the weaknesses in passwords. I can't foot stomp enough the importance of password managers. Nobody wants to be keeping up with hundreds of passwords. Password managers help you do that securely and safely. And so those are the things that we would advocate.
Yeah, I would agree, and also add one thing the DDC team does well is talk about creating the culture of cybersecurity, and that you're only as strong as your weakest link. So I think I see a lot in campaigns, maybe they worry about protecting the candidate's account, but the interns, the volunteers, or even the campaign manager, as well as any third-party vendors they're working with, they're not on top of that so much. So making sure that everyone is using those few simple best practices from the get-go is really important. I think another thing is, while we hope people are prepared, incidents do happen. And I think creating a culture where you report it right away in a small organization, and I think this gets at a broader theme about the culture of cybersecurity that's so important, something I'm so excited about when we talk about this incident response or threat intel sharing that we're doing across industry, civil society, and government, is that being transparent in a challenging time. And I think that is a challenge in politics when it can be contested races or things, people might not want to admit. There's the same way, that's a problem across the industry. People don't want to admit that they've had a problem. But I think that's a really important part, thinking about this campaign space, is like, hey, it's okay if you're confused, if something goes wrong, report it right away, and consider sharing those learnings out with others.
Two questions from the audience that have come in that are somewhat related and touch on hotspot issues. One is the question, what is being done to protect against insider threats in the U.S. election security system? And then the other question is election fraud a significant issue? We've heard politicians talk about it a lot on both sides of the issue, but what are you seeing from CISA's point of view, Jeff?
So I'll start with the first question. Just in late May, we released an insider threat guide for election officials. What that helps election officials to do is walk through basically their chain of custody process to understand where they have particular vulnerabilities, where they can recover from those vulnerabilities should they be presented with an insider threat actor. We're not attributing anyone as being insider threats or in a position to say that we expect insider threat activity. We are aware that election officials have raised this as a concern and asked for us to derive guidance from our support to critical infrastructure broadly. So that's one of the strengths of working across all critical infrastructure sectors, as CISA does. We're able to pull the best practices from one sector and apply them elsewhere. To your second point, election fraud is a law enforcement issue. CISA is not a law enforcement organization. We work very closely with FBI, who has election crimes coordinators in every field office, all of their 56 field offices, and we encourage that should any suspicion of election fraud take place, they engage law enforcement right away.
There's also a question here, and we've touched on it tangentially so far, about domestic fringe actors, and this gets into, again, the idea of the disinformation environment and social media. So what, from your experience, as all of you have been looking at the midterms and what is out there, what are you seeing from fringe actors? Are there any things that you see on social media, influence operations, disinformation operations, that have got your concern at this point?
Every day.
Yeah, well, I think there's no question that our foreign adversaries exploit existing fissures. This is when we've looked at what Russia has done in the area of disinformation. It's not as though they're creating new points and new forms of disinformation. What they're doing is amplifying existing points, and we've seen that time and time again, both in the political sector. There was a famous, and this has a real-world effect. Let me just give a 2-second example of several years ago. You recall there were wildfires, terrible forest fires out in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, and a Facebook post suggested that these were created by Antifa protesters, that this was deliberate arson. There was no basis for that, but it was a Facebook post. It was sort of circulated a little bit and didn't go really viral until a Russian outlet picked it up, amplified it, exaggerated it. RT then reported on the fact that it was being amplified, and then there were tweets, all manufactured by fake Facebook personas controlled by Russia, reporting on the fact that RT was reporting on it, so it sort of took on a life of its own. What was the culmination? The culmination was that people in Oregon, receiving this information on social media, started setting up roadblocks to block, to catch the Antifa protesters who were setting up these, who were initiating these arson. Didn't exist. It got to the point where the Douglas County Sheriff asked the FBI to issue a bulletin, a joint bulletin, which they did. It's you can still read it on the web, asking people to please stop believing this. There are no Antifa protesters setting arson fires in the Pacific Northwest, and you're blocking evacuation routes because you've got these roadblocks. So it became a public safety issue, all created, all manufactured with a real-world effect just by Russian amplification of existing divisions. Totally true. There's several reports on it online. So I think while politicians focus on voting fraud and threats to our election security, and as I said, I think that's extremely unlikely, not impossible. Again, a sophisticated adversary could have an effect on our election counting, on voter registration rolls, et cetera, on the mechanics. I think the far greater, more pernicious, more insidious effect is on the disinformation operations, where we have several foreign adversaries that are willing to exploit our existing fissures. We have to rely for the first time in our nation's history really on the private sector, the social media companies, to police this. This is not a pure government issue for the reasons I explained already given the First Amendment. So this is something that's in the private sector's responsibility. It's on all of us to address. And one country in particular, I'll just make this point very quickly, I think that we have to focus on long-term in this area, in the election area, is Russia. Russia is perfectly free. We've seen Vladimir Putin is perfectly free to break norms and engage in getting involved in our domestic politics. I do not think that Chinese are interested in doing that. They have too much at risk, too much at stake, and it undermines their own position as a peaceful, friendly neighbor in Asia if they are seen as subverting a democracy. Russia does not have that problem. They are free to act with impunity in this area. So I think while China may in some ways be a far greater long-term challenge, in the election context, I think it's Russia, and in particular, I'm focused on 2024.
Two questions. Large social media companies, and a number of them in recent weeks, have come out and announced what they're doing to help promote and secure the elections. Are they doing enough? Are they taking the right approaches? And then from a government point of view, CISA had the rumor control website last election cycle. What has CISA been able to do in order to shoot down some of the rumors that have flown around previously and perhaps will fly again as we get closer to the midterms?
I can take the last part of that. So we still have our Rumor versus Reality webpage. It was updated last, I believe, in June. But a lot of what we're doing is recognizing that some of the disinformation that they're facing is localized. So we are looking to put the tools and resources and guidance in place to help election officials be empowered to address their constituencies and help to address their misunderstandings and misgivings. And then we can be an amplifying voice of those trusted voices throughout the election sector. So we've released things in partnership with the election community, like a rumor control startup guide. What are the factors that one considers when pre-bunking or debunking misinformation? How do you avoid amplifying it if it's already winding down? How do you make those decision criteria on your own? The other is a planning and incident response guide for things like misdis and malinformation in order to think through crisis communications, to anticipate some of these, to track and ensure that you're being effective in communicating to diverse audiences.
So, social media firms, I believe, must be responsible for the content that they host on their platforms. But that's not the end of the story. We as readers and consumers have also have responsibility for verifying what we're reading, particularly if we intend to take some action based on it. So social media firms are certainly aware, have been called down to the Hill enough times now, and to answer on it, and I believe that they have certainly taken action. I believe there's more to be done, and they have to continue to tighten up the controls in place to minimize the false reports and the disinformation, particularly during our election cycles, so important. And then, activities like those hosted by CISA where I'd like to see that get more press. I'd like to see more people using it to verify whether what they're reading is true, and there should be other avenues for doing that also.
Is it a bit of a misnomer? We seem to do this every 2 years or every 4 years. We talk about election security, but you mentioned earlier the need for a security culture. Is this a problem that maybe won't get better if it's just looked at through the lens of election security? Does it need to be a bigger picture focus on just general security, whether it's understanding disinformation and misinformation, understanding cybersecurity? Is that something that needs to be baked in or built in better across society? And if so, how much of a difference would that make when it comes to the elections?
I mean, for sure. For years, we've been talking about the importance of baking in security and introducing cybersecurity to elementary school kids earlier in their educational cycle. I think we, as a global economy dependent on technology, have certainly made significant strides in the areas of security. And I'll talk specifically about the United States. Significant amounts of effort put into both standards and security protections and improving our ability to protect, but we're not there yet. Right? We still have work to do to create that culture of security. It still, in many instances, is a second thought instead of an integrated thought at the time that you are creating and building and delivering capabilities. So we have to continue to talk about it and continue to educate at more junior levels, get our kids who are better at technology than many of us, need to know how to be smart from a security perspective too.
Debbie, I agree. I think, if you take a step back and look at just the history of technological innovation, we are still in the very, very early stages of the digital revolution. And if you look at other new technologies, they took decades, whether it was electricity, radio, TV, automobile, pick whatever, airplanes. They took decades between the time of invention and the time they became impactful and ubiquitous and a factor in everyday life. Here, Facebook really became a thing in our everyday life only in, 2010 or something like that. YouTube wasn't even created until 2005 or so. And so it's sort of no surprise that this digital revolution has washed over us in just, 10, 15 years in terms of really have a day-to-day effect on our lives. So no surprise that we're lagging behind in forming our rules of how we want to engage in social media, how we've got the right protections, and you've just mentioned the culture of security. I think we'll get there, but the problem is that the vulnerabilities are extending so great and so quickly that they're outpacing our ability to address them. We're catching up. We're certainly better than we were 5 years ago, but this is going to be a 20-year phenomenon.
I don't think that elections are an organizing principle for our adversaries. Certainly the disinformation shifts from topic to topic. Instead, they represent a high consequence vulnerability, a high consequence opportunity for adversaries to take advantage of. But absolutely, this means that these types of threats are persistent and shift their focus from elections when convenient to other topics or other divisive issues. So it absolutely will require a holistic cultural push towards security.
We're just about out of time, but very quickly, I'd like to ask all of you, perhaps we can go down the line. With now less than 2 months until the actual elections, what are you looking for? What are you looking out for in that time? And what do you hope the American people look out for as we get closer to the election day? Deborah?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I believe the American public are looking for confidence that they can go to the polls and that their vote will count. And I think the more that we talk about this, the more that we instill that level of confidence by talking about the security measures that have been taken, by talking about what's happening at the federal level and at the state level, by talking about what we're doing at the campaign level, and by tightening up the social media disinformation issues, the better chance we have. And so what I can say is vote, vote, vote.
Glenn.
I'm not sure I have much to add beyond what I've already said. I think this upcoming election is probably going to be quite safe and quite secure for the reasons we've talked about. My concerns are about future elections and the role of disinformation, and I think anything we can do in the meantime to encourage politicians to act more responsibly and not focus on politically exciting things, comments about voter fraud, and educate the public about the pernicious effect of disinformation is going to be important. It's a long-term struggle that we have in front of us.
Real quickly, if anyone does have doubts about the security of the way their elections are run, one of the best ways that we've seen to understand that process is to volunteer as a poll worker, to go through the poll worker training to understand what controls are in place and how the process is administered. That seems to be the most effective way to engender confidence, is to actually get involved.
Between now and elections and rolling forward into presidential preparation, we'll be focusing on promoting authoritative information on search and YouTube, equipping campaigns, which is my kind of sliver of that, and then preventing abuse on our platforms. But I would say it's still not too late to think about those cybersecurity basics, password manager, security keys to SV, and we'll be, saying that rolling into November and beyond. So not too late if folks who consider themselves high risk haven't done that yet to take some precautions.
There's a lot more we could talk about. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Please help me in thanking our panel. And just as a reminder, please join us now in the exhibit hall outside of the Potomac Ballrooms after this for a networking and exhibits break. Thanks so much.